Welcome to Censored. I'm Aoife Vertnach. If you'd like to support the show, there are links to both Patreon and merch in the show notes. Today, I'm talking about a book called Sister of the Road, the autobiography of boxcar Bertha. This was published in 1937, and the author is As Told to Dr. Ben L. Reitman. As told rather than written by, which is kind of strange. Dr. Reitman is best remembered by history because he was the lover of Emma Goldman. She was extremely important in anarchist circles in early 20th century America, lecturing to thousands on political philosophy, labour relations, birth control, you name it. If it was radical, she spoke about it. Reitman was known as the hobo doctor and a red light gynecologist. A biographer claims he was like the Forrest Gump of American radical politics. In other words, he met nearly everyone at everything. As for Bertha, whose memoir this is supposed to be, well, that's kind of complicated and we'll get to that later. My choice for a drink to go with the book this time is whiskey. Bertha, the main character, and Mary, a destitute Irish woman, share half a bottle after they've been discharged from a municipal lodging house. This was a kind of workhouse where homeless women signed in for a bed for one night. They surrendered all their own clothes, which are then fumigated to kill lice. They wore institutional night clothes, washed communally, and slept together in dormitories. After a night listening to each other coughing and hacking, they were discharged together to find a bed elsewhere or wait until later to be readmitted. After this grim institutional experience, Mary wants a drink. She buys half a bottle of whiskey on tick and shares it with Bertha and another woman. So much about this story was poignant, I thought, not least because homelessness is once again as bad as it was in the early 20th century when this book is set. I think it's the fellowship that Mary offers Bertha through the whiskey that made it really stand out for me. Alcohol does appear a lot in this book, often in very moral terms. Bertha likes to tell us that it leads to bad life choices and that it defines a good or a bad hobo. But for a brief moment, this glass of whiskey represents sharing and comfort. I'm raising a glass to Mary, who isn't a political rebel or a charismatic leader. She's just a woman trying to make her way in the world. Now that we have a drink sorted, it's time to consider why this book was banned. I think, to be honest, it's the front cover, and not because it has a booby lady or a titillating illustration, but the strapline. This is what it says: "The frank, uncensored story of a wandering woman of the underworld. Intimate facts of a woman hobo's methods and habits, a life story that has no parallel." These two sentences are a veritable feast of words that would have triggered the Irish censors. Firstly, and most importantly, uncensored. That word just screams ban me now. In the blacklists, there are lots of titles with the word uncensored in them. It seems to have been particularly popular as a magazine title in the mid-20th century. These mags were very gossipy, true-life kind of publications, a bit like the National Enquirer. And some of them were quite like those ones you see in the supermarket, you know, the ones talking about terrible family drama, like soap operas on steroids. That's what uncensored, true-life confessional magazines were like. In this publishing landscape and in the marketing language of the time, uncensored obviously means salaciousness, but also a type of honesty that is tough and uncompromising. Then there are our old favourites, frank and intimate. The book in the last episode, Whack, A Woman's Story of the War, also had intimate in its strapline. Alongside the adjective frank, it suggests sex stuff, borrowing from the language of porno novels. It's funny, isn't it, that non-fiction was sold as frank and intimate, but fiction wasn't. Readers of autobiography were looking for thrills, I think, in a way that they weren't open to saying when they read a fictional novel. Alright, I admit it, the censors probably didn't read much beyond the strapline, banning it on the front cover alone. But I did try to read it, And I can assure you that it was both frank and intimate. It lived up to that publicity. Factual, on the other hand, I have questions about that. So when you crack open the book, the gritty realism of Boxcar Bertha's story is established straight away. It might open in this conventional memoir form with the author's birth and parentage, but that's really all the relationship it bears to a story of a life well lived, which is what most memoirs were at the time. Bertha is born to a restless mother who moves between many men, marrying or not marrying according to her taste. All these blokes seem relaxed about her past and parent her children without much of a fuss. Bertha's mother believes in free love, a phrase I thought came from the 60s, but obviously comes from much earlier. The family lives on a farm sometimes, then they're in a lodging house in a town, and then in encampments next to a railway. Of course, the censors would have died to read such casual couplings unsanctified by marriage and religion. The cheek of these people to leave relationships just because it wasn't working out. We're only in the first few pages, and already Bertha's life is unacceptable. Her nickname, Boxcar, comes from spending so much time around trains. When her mother is looking for her, she invariably finds the child in a boxcar, which is a type of freight car. You know them from the films. They're these high, enclosed cars, completely shut in, and there's a big sliding door on the side. Her nickname prefigures her adult life, when she spends many years hitching free rides on trains. In the censor's worldview, bad as the feckless mother was, Bertha turns out to be much, much worse. I'm certain they didn't read beyond chapter 1, really, because this was a very easy prohibition order to issue. But I did keep going, because I'm duty-bound to read the filth for your edification, and my own. And there was plenty of scandalous carry-on in Bertha's life. Her first lover, she's 16 and he's an adult, is also her mother's long-term boyfriend, which is a lot. Free love really does mean pushing the boundaries of propriety in Bertha's case. I thought it was kind of unbelievable that there was no family drama created by this decision. To be clear, it's not as if this was a negotiated polyamorous relationship. This was all happening on the fly. So this is her mother's reaction when she tells her that she's slept with her boyfriend. For a moment, a strange, drawn look crossed her face. Then she smiled quietly and turned to him. "Do you think, then, that you are strong enough for the two of us?" was all she asked him. What a line from Mammy. It's extremely soap opera. But isn't that moment of a strange, drawn look quite telling? There's a lot going on there that Bertha chooses not to discuss. The other notable thing about Bertha's early life, apart from shagging her mammy's fella, is her education. She grew up in a cooperative colony, which provided work and education for the children. They had an informal school, which was extremely radical. Bertha writes of their curriculum. Mostly we learnt about the inconsistencies of religion and about governments, labour and economics. We were taught that the capitalist system was wrong and that people are poor because they are exploited. So, it was socialism school. It does sound interesting, but it was probably a bit stodgy for young children, if her description is true. Labour and economics, famously sexy subjects for the under-10s. The inspiration for the school was that of Francisco Ferrer, a Spanish anarchist who founded radical secular schools. So Bertha is telling her readers that she received the most advanced, radical, free-thinking education available in the most liberated colony setting imaginable. I think contemporary readers were supposed to be a little shocked. Naturally, I just think it sounds like a cult, but without the God bit. The colony members are the first of the radical alternative thinkers who appear in the book. A few chapters in, I was beginning to think there wasn't a socialist in America she hadn't met. She attends lectures by anarchists in packed halls. She shares booze with socialists who debate all night in dodgy apartments. She works with union organisers to run conferences for hobos. These men and women are admirable, self-sacrificial figures dedicated to advocating for the poor and marginal in America. But we have to turn then to the inevitable question. How true or historically accurate was this autobiography? We have to turn again to the odd part in the title, as told to Dr. Ben L. Reitman. At first, I just thought he was a ghostwriter. Nothing odd about that. But about 7 chapters in, I began to have doubts about the Bertha-Ben relationship. FYI, there are 23 chapters and 1 appendix, so I was a long way from finishing it when I began to query what was going on. I had a lot of questions on who Ben Reitman was at this point. Luckily, and not surprisingly, other readers have had questions about Reitman too. There's at least one doctoral thesis on the authorship and veracity of this book. To be honest, I'm shocked anyone took this book as true. When it was published in 1937, reviews raised the issue of truth, but that was more about the social details depicted by Bertha. So those reviews were like, I don't know, it seems unlikely that hobo women existed in this way. They wondered, can it really be true that Bertha travelled all over America as a hobo, even though she was a woman? My argument would be that women hobos surely existed, but that Boxcar Bertha did not write this book. Bertha reflects real historic people, but she was created by Ben Reitman. I would like to rewrite the strapline, as told to Ben Reitman, to read as told by Ben Reitman with the help of Bertha. And the other strapline gave me a lightbulb moment too. The frank, uncensored story of a wandering woman of the underworld is the line, okay? And it's that word, underworld, that really grabbed my attention. People living in poverty in cities have often been cast as denizens of an underworld, a subterranean place, a parallel alternative society where normal morals and rules do not apply. Ghettos were often understood this way by police, charities, and politicians. It's an idea that lots of writers have explored. You might remember that ages ago I read Home to Harlem by Claude McKay, in which he described the self-contained life of that famous black neighbourhood in the 1920s. In the Harlem clubs he so lusciously described were rich white people come to watch and wonder at the locals. Similar nightclub tourists appear in Christopher Isherwood's Goodbye to Berlin, which I also did an episode on. But in this case, they are Americans come to oogle the queer underbelly of the German capital. These rich outsiders were slumming it. And slumming it was a phrase coined to describe this peculiar form of voyeurism. But it wouldn't be fair to say that Reitman is slumming it, because he himself grew up poor in Chicago. He was once a full-time hobo. He knew poverty and he knew the life he wrote about. So slumming it feels a bit inaccurate. I don't know if any of you have read Jack London or George Orwell, but I thought there were a lot of echoes of those socially conscious, politically aware writers in Sisters of the Road. George Orwell's Down and Out in Paris and London was published in 1933, 4 years before Bertha's story appeared. Jack London's famous People of the Abyss was from 1903, so there was plenty of time for Reitman to take inspiration from that. London and Orwell were doing another kind of slumming, that undertaken for social research reasons. And there is an echo of that in Sisters of the Road. But those two lads, Orwell and London, were themselves in their works. Theirs were written as straightforward, first-person point-of-view accounts. It's fair to say that separating Reitman from Bertha is not easy. His friends thought he had written about a real woman, but couldn't be sure which person inspired Bertha. And remember, they did know a lot of women hobos and Reitman well, so they were speculating in letters between each other as to who Bertha might be. Some felt that he had put more of himself into the book than anyone else. I think to honour this symbiotic relationship between Bertha, the character of the autobiography, and Reitman, the author, it would be best to speak of the main character as Ben/Bertha. A very perceptive scholar, Martha Lynn Rice, argued that Reitman poured himself into Bertha, creating a fantastic, composite character that was both a confession and an elaborate disappearing act. At the heart of Ben/Bertha, then, is some serious gender bending. Now that sounds really compelling, doesn't it? But it kind of oversells the book a bit, because it's a bit of a bewildering read. And the reason it's a bit overwhelming is all the sociology Ben/Bertha stuffed into it. The stories of hundreds of poor individuals appear here. I mean, there are just different people on nearly every page. They're all sorted by name, gender, occupation, ethnicity, and, for want of a better word, type. For example, Mary, the whiskey drinker I mentioned at the beginning, is an apolitical, downtrodden, homeless white woman. She isn't a hobo, because a hobo is someone who embraces travelling as a counterculture revolutionary kind of experience. Documenting real, genuine, authentic hobos is what Ben/Bertha are trying to do. And this leads to a lot of classification and definitions, which really don't make for a very sexy read. By the time I reached the appendix, I was a bit fed up of all of the information that was being shoved into the text. Then I got a bit cross, because the appendix was all the sociological stuff from the main narrative condensed into lists. Why had I even bothered to read the bloody book? I felt very cheated. And the ending was a bit shit. It's a really saccharine, happy ending, where Ben/Bertha settles down to raise a family, taking on the role of a proper mammy some years after giving birth, and leaving the child without a backward glance. Ben/Bertha couldn't even give the child a name. They chose Baby Dear because all babies are dear. I mean, it feels like a generic infant, not an actual child. Anyway, we could talk all day about the baffling stuff in this book, but we need to do censorship bingo, because I think it really reveals the sheer range of human experience Ben/Bertha tried to tell their readers about. So we start, as usual, with breasts. Yes, of course. Surely the funniest mention of the human mammary gland is in the famous appendix. Guess why some women turned hobo, according to Ben/Bertha? Because they possessed both, quote, the tiny and massive breast, unquote. I shit you not, it actually says that. Only women with middling-sized boobs were safe from wanderlust. You heard it first here, ladies. Then we have bestiality. I don't think so, but I will admit that my eyes glazed over a few times because the detail on every page was just too much for me. I wouldn't be surprised if it was hinted at, because nearly everything else was. Then sex work. Oh yes, absolutely, nearly every page, I would say. Ben/Bertha themselves become a sex worker as some sort of psychological experiment. It's a form of participant observation, where a researcher immerses themselves in the lives of their subject. As a result of their stint in the brothel, Ben/Bertha get pregnant and give birth to a child they call Baby Dear. As I said before, all babies are dear. So yeah, we can definitely tick sex work. Next up, racism. Well, race in America is not ignored. The segregation of social services in Chicago gets mentioned, for example. But the violence of racism isn't as prominent as you'd expect. I get the impression Ben/Bertha didn't talk to Black Americans as part of their social survey work. So I will tick it, but it's a bit of a half-hearted tick, really. I was disappointed. Then drugs. Oh yes. Opium addiction is described in detail, and addiction to drink is also acknowledged. Next, politics. Definitely. It's stuffed with radical politics. If you were worried about Reds under the bed, this book would have scared the bejesus out of you. Then swearing. Not much, actually, given it's, the life of the streets. Various characters do say damned, so that counts as swearing in 1937. Fun fact, actually, a biography of Reitman is called The Damnedest Radical. Seems kind of appropriate. Next, then, infidelity. Oh God, yeah. I mean, free love is the only way here. If people are married, they are expected to shag other people. But most couples, according to the narrator, are not married at all. Then we have crime. Yes, endless amounts of crime, from small-time offences like not paying for a train ticket to serious larceny and murder. So we can definitely tick that. Genitalia. Well, this is a difficult one because the references to genitalia are more implied than explicit. There's douching, VD examinations, swabs, and birth, but never direct mention of vulvas and vaginas. And there's hardly anything about male genitalia at all. But I do think that there's enough implied and it's very frequent. So I think that would be shocking enough in 1937. I think I can tick it. Next up, abortion. Yes, there's most of a chapter devoted to a work of an abortionist, Dr. Stone, who also happens to be a woman doctor. Ben Reitman himself also performed abortions, illegally of course, since there is no legal abortion in America at this time. So yes, we're ticking that one. And next up, one that I hardly ever get to tick. Orgies. It's got to be the least used heading. But this time, I think I can tick it. Bertha's sister offers to share her lovers with her. There's no precise details, but it could be that an orgy was on the table. It's not the only time that consciously sharing sexual partners is discussed, so I think a number of the implications could certainly be read as orgies. I can finally tick this. I think that's only the second time in the whole podcast. Amazing. Then we have sexual assault. Yes, though told with a detached air. Stylistically, this autobiography is not very immediate, it's not looking to shock. The sociology thread makes the narrative very factual and a bit unemotional. And the next one is extramarital pregnancy. Yes, like I said, Bertha has a baby outside marriage, as do lots of other women encountered in the text. Next, masturbation. Now this is another rarely ticked box, but yes, I can tick it this time. Once again, it's in the appendix. Like the small and massive breast, it is apparently a contributing factor to hoboism in women. And then sex toys. Well, sadly, I don't think so. Next up, feminism. Yes, although Ben Bertha make plenty of misogynistic statements about gender roles too, this isn't exactly a model of feminist thought, but it's definitely there. I can tick it. Then we have divorce. Yes, because that's another reason women take to the road. They come from broken homes where parents are divorced. I can certainly tick that. Once again, the appendix comes to the rescue. Then contraception. Absolutely, I think all that douching after sex counts as contraception. Next up, menstruation. Now this is almost never ticked as well, but yes, in this text, periods get a mention. One of Bertha's acquaintances has a grifting trick involving embarrassing men by talking about periods, which is just genius. I'll read it out to you because it's actually very funny. The first place we stopped was a big drugstore. "I want to see the manager," said May. "Yes, ladies, and what can I do for you? We girls are sick and haven't any money. Will you trust us for some Kotex?" she asked without any embarrassment. The manager blushed furiously and hemmed and hawed. "Why, certainly," he said, avoiding her eyes. "Is there anything else you'd like?" "Well, it would be very kind of you to give us a soda, and we could use a little face powder." And that's how the girls got soda, face powder, and sanitary products all for free. They mortified a man into giving it to them. I just think this is brilliant. So yes, I'm definitely ticking menstruation. Then we have blasphemy. Well, yes, I mean Bertha's socialist education was all about the evils of religion. Next up is another rarely ticked box, oral sex. But yes, once again, I can actually tick it. This book is just remarkable. Now maybe I'm overreading this. I'll let you decide. And this is from chapter 12, when Bertha is sleeping with Bill, her pimp. This bloke is so good in bed that she happily works as a prostitute for him. So I'm just going to read it out. Bill slept with me again that night. In spite of all my thinking during the day, all of me waited for his fingers and his lips, and by morning there was no decision in me one way or the other. There you go. Of course, he could be doing anything but oral sex with the lips, but come on. Let's take it. I think we should tick this one. I never get to tick it. And then finally, the last section on the bingo card. LGBTQ plus content. And absolutely loads of it. Apart from the authorial experiment of Ben Bertha, there are gay men, lesbians, and even a casual reference to trans people. This text has been used as a source by scholars working on lesbian history because it pays such close attention to groups that are usually ignored. Now that doesn't mean Ben Bertha are nice about lesbians. They're often judgmental and moralistic. But this is an extremely rich text if you're interested in sexual and gender diversity. So yeah, I'm ticking that one too. Counting it all up, the final score for Sister of the Road is 23 out of 25. Bestiality and sex toys were the only boxes not ticked. This is a blockbuster of transgressive content and the highest ever score in censorship bingo. The strapline is right. This is a life story that has no parallel. Now, it's not the best read, okay? It's more a research project than a memoir. All that truth and veracity should have convinced the censors to let it through. I mean, the strapline makes it sound sensational, but it's kind of a technical social work thing. But the opposite seems to have been the case. Real-life stories, for the Irish censor at least, in all their messy, complicated glory, were verboten. Some people's lives were just wrong, and their life stories had to be erased. What an awful system it was. My next episode will continue the memoir theme, but it's a British author this time, so there won't be any hobos or railroad tracks. I mean, there might be workhouses. Till then, keep your hands clean and your minds filthy.